Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name's Ruth Watson. My guest this evening is Maureen Watt, retired SNP MSP for Aberdeen South and North Kincardine. Good evening, Maureen. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Ruth.
So,
Nice to see you again.
I will run through the Ukraine update and the headlines, and then we'll come to Maureen and get her views on the news of the evening. The Ukraine update, day 719. Ukraine has said Russian forces are using terminals of Elon Musk's satellite internet service Starlink in occupied areas. The Ukrainian military released what it said was an intercept of an exchange between two Russian soldiers as proof of systemic use. Starlink systems have been vital for Ukraine's battlefield communications throughout Russia's nearly 2-year invasion. Starlink said it did not sell terminals to Russia, it was not aware of others doing so, and its network did not operate in Russia. However, statements by the company and Elon Musk avoided addressing concerns that Russian troops might be obtaining and using them regardless, including on illegally Russian-occupied Ukrainian soil. Ukraine's air defense systems destroyed 14 out of 17 drones that Russia launched and one Kh-59 cruise missile, Ukraine's Air Force said on Monday. It added that Russians also launched S-300 missiles, but it did not say what, if anything, was hit. Oleh Syniehubov, governor of the Kharkiv region in Ukraine's northeast, said late on Sunday that Russia attacked his region with S-300 missiles launched from Belgorod inside Russia. He said that according to preliminary information, there were no casualties, but the facades of some non-residential buildings were damaged. Serhiy Lysak, governor of the Dnipropetrovsk region, said late on Sunday that Russia attacked the city of Pavlograd with drones. There were no casualties, but some parts of the city lost electricity. Democrats and some Republicans in the U.S. Senate have moved closer to passing a $95 billion aid package for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan, showing bipartisanship despite opposition from Republican hardliners and Donald Trump. The Senate voted 67 to 27 in a rare Sunday session to clear the latest procedural hurdle and move the bill towards an ultimate vote on passage. It would then have to go to the House of Representatives, where there is the prospect of further Republican obstruction, but also support on both sides for Ukraine. President Volodymyr Zelensky has appointed Alexander Pavlyuk, former Deputy Defense Minister, as the new commander of Ukraine's ground forces. Pavlyuk, a lieutenant general who served in the ministry role for a year, replaces Colonel General Alexander Syrsky as commander of Ukraine's armed forces. The UK Ministry of Defence said there were indications Russia's war was contributing to a shortage of healthcare professionals across Russia. In an intelligence update, the Ministry of Defence added the heavy resource and financial burden of the war was negatively affecting a range of civilian sectors. Japan will pledge 15.8 billion yen in aid to Ukraine at a conference to be held in Tokyo on the 19th of February, Kyodo News reported on Sunday. The funding will be used for reconstruction in 7 areas, including agriculture and the disposal of rubble, Kyodo said. Looking at the headlines before we come to the stories, Israeli strikes on Gaza have killed 28,340 Palestinians and injured 67,984 since the 7th of October, the health ministry in Gaza has said. The SNP has written to Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer, urging them to change course and back an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, amid mounting concern over Benjamin Netanyahu's plans for a major military assault on Rafah. The UK government's controversial Rwanda legislation that deems the African country as a safe place to deport people is fundamentally incompatible with the UK's human rights obligations and places it in breach of international law, according to a damning parliamentary report. The Resolution Foundation said people across the UK face a triple savings challenge of insufficient savings, an inability to cope financially with major life events, such as family breakdown and inadequate retirement incomes, as more than 11 million working age people in the UK don't have the basic rainy day savings of at least £1,000. New analysis has found that Brexit red tape is costing almost £100 billion in annual UK exports. The Scottish Conservative Education spokesperson, Ros McCall, has insisted that she does support the Scottish Government's policy of free university tuition fees after the Conservative Party was criticised following comments by Tory finance spokesperson Liz Smith. Media mogul Rupert Murdoch has met Rishi Sunak 5 times over a 12-month period before he stepped down as the chair of News Corp. Members of Spain's Conservative People's Party say they are stupefied after their party leader announced he was in favour of granting a conditional pardon to former Catalan President Carles Puigdemont for his role in the Catalan independence campaign in 2017. The White House has rebuked Donald Trump for saying he would encourage Russia to attack any of the US NATO allies whom he considers not to have met their financial obligations. And finally, if I can get this page unstuck. A new study has suggested that people's trust in the NHS across the UK was linked to increased uptake of the COVID-19 vaccine during the pandemic, and that Scotland is comes out very well on top of all that. Well, I mean, geez, Louise, Maureen, that's an action-packed programme. It's 7 minutes past and we've not even had a chat to you yet, so there's a lot to get through. So, I mean, looking at Gaza, I mean, there's international pressure growing on Israel to hold back amid threats to invade Rafah, which is the last place that the people of Gaza have been told they can go to as a safe space. I mean, what's your perspective on this unfolding humanitarian catastrophe? What's going on with Israel? Why are they doing this?
Well, I think it's been clear, that as this has gone on, that Netanyahu's goal is to completely obliterate Gaza as a place that's habitable, and to displace as many of its citizens as it possibly can, never minding how many people they kill or injure on the way. I mean, the figures that you read out earlier are absolutely awful. I mean, it's just catastrophic. And people have been hounded from the north to the south as the Israelis have gone on their bombing campaign from north to south, allegedly, to try and root out Hamas from their tunnels, smoke out, if you like, Hamas from their tunnels and everywhere that they may be. And now most people are at Rafah, where the crossing is, of course, to Egypt. But my understanding is that the crossing is, not easily penetrable. It just is through a number of openings, if you like. And yes, they're really up against them, if you like. And all along, the only way that Netanyahu will listen to anybody is to those that are giving him arms to carry out this terrible atrocity. And that
I mean, I know that the Dutch appeals court today ordered the Dutch government to block all exports of F-35 fighter jet parts to Israel within 7 days, according to Reuters. I mean, is this the way ahead for people, for different governments, perhaps fearing international court appearances? Is this the way for them to perhaps be stepping forward if Israel's not listening to cries for reason? Is how,
I mean,
how
if that's happening in one country, then clearly it would be a good idea if it happened for other countries as well. But I come back to the point that, the United States have always been the main backer of Israel. And unless they're prepared to say, right, we're cutting off all arms, then, are the amounts being sent by other countries enough to keep them going? And anyway, they're nearly at the end game, aren't they, if they're down at Rafah? So, I
Well,
mean, it's then got to come to some sort of negotiation.
I mean, Israel did free 2 Israeli hostages who were taken in the 7th of October hostage taking that was initiated by Hamas. So, one could argue that they are achieving their objective, which is to release Israeli hostages. Is that not a fair point?
But that's two since when? I mean, has it got to go on all, is it 2 a month, or, how long is that going to take? Because there are how many, 100 plus, 150 plus hostages? And, there are thousands, I understand, of Palestinians who are held by the Israelis, so that they want in return. So how long is that going to take? I mean, peace doesn't seem very close, does it?
I mean, we've got now the UK government has finally announced sanctions on 4 extremist Israeli settlers who've committed human rights abuses against Palestinian communities in the West Bank, the Foreign Office said. And UK Foreign Secretary David Cameron has said Israel should stop and think seriously before taking further action in Rafah, adding that many of the people in the city had already fled from other areas and had nowhere else to go. I mean, I think there's well over 1 million people who are now living in the area, many of them in absolutely horrific circumstances and without food and without fresh water. I mean, we've got Stephen Flynn now demanding that Sunak and Starmer back an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. The SNP has written to Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, urging them to change course. In a letter today, Stephen Flynn MP warned that action would amount to waging war in the largest refugee camp in the world, with 1.5 million Palestinians sheltering in the region. I mean, it's pretty unfathomable, really, isn't it, to think of? I mean, it's if you can imagine somebody just going and bombing Edinburgh.
It just doesn't bear thinking about. We're talking about the whole country being the size of Ireland, aren't we? And imagine, 1 million plus people being kettled into a very small part of that. I mean, it's just unthinkable. And people eating grass and having no drinking water, and any aid trucks that do get through are just looted by desperate people. You can understand that. So the humanitarian, catastrophe, I must use that word again, that is there in Gaza just doesn't bear thinking about. But Netanyahu obviously doesn't give a damn. And I'm lost for words. It's just awful to think about it.
It's interesting to note that in Haaretz, the Israeli news outlet, they're reporting that there seemed to be an increasing narrative with people, really losing patience with Netanyahu. That the economy's been downgraded. Many Israelis are asking, what do we become as a nation after we come to the other side of what's happened in Gaza? And there's some serious reflection going on among many, although obviously there are many within the Zionist population, the Zionist community, who still support it. But what are we really witnessing, as with Putin, perhaps, the sort of the desperate last kicks of somebody who is a bit of a despot, trying desperately not to go to prison? I mean, is this what Netanyahu's all about, or is there something more to this?
From what I've read, I don't think he sees himself as that, does he? Although he is facing corruption charge, isn't he? But does he think that this will keep him in power? Does he think that this is, as you say, that the majority of the population wants? Certainly there is an increasing voice of opinion against him. But as long as the hostages are not freed, I think that he will feel that he has majority support until that happens. But has he got a plan after he's obliterated Gaza? I don't know.
The plan seems to be to set up Israeli settlements in it, according to a number of other Israeli reports. Moving on to Rwanda, the UK government's controversial Rwanda legislation that deems the African country as a safe place to deport people to is fundamentally incompatible with the UK's human rights obligations and places it in breach of international law, according to a damning parliamentary report. MPs and peers from the cross-party Joint Committee on Human Rights have delivered a critical analysis of the safety of the Rwanda bill, which is progressing at speed through Westminster. The aim of the bill is to counter the judgment of the Supreme Court last November that found Rwanda was not a safe country to which UK asylum seekers could be forcibly removed. The bill states that Rwanda is in fact a safe country and that anyone sent there by the UK government will not be forcibly removed to an unsafe country. This report finds it is unclear whether this can be guaranteed in practice. I mean, it's a remarkable it's a remarkable story, this, isn't it? I mean, you had Kemi Badenoch MP, I can't remember which minister she is, saying that it was racist to say that Rwanda was not safe because it is, it's racist to say it's not safe just because it's an African country. But I mean, is that, are we just being gaslit here? Sort of, is racism being used as a spurious argument, and perhaps to try and counter the serious complaints that this is a racist policy because it's using sort of the African continent as a threat? I mean, it's what do you make of this whole sort of bizarre and deeply unpleasant policy?
Well, Kemi Badenoch introducing racism to it is just a smokescreen for how bad this policy is. And, this is a cross-party committee of MPs in the House of Commons coming out with this report. So that means there must be Tories on it as well. Now, did they have the guts when this bill was going through Parliament, because they must have been taking evidence for this during that time, did they have the guts to vote against or abstain from this bill? And I doubt it. So, there's double speak here, if you like, by the Tories on this. But this should be taken very seriously. And remember, this bill is virtually saying, if I say a cat is a dog, then it is a dog. That's how bad this legislation is, declaring that Rwanda is a safe place, whether the evidence says it or not. And this is unprecedented for any government, I would say. And if it wasn't the UK, it would probably be, well, let's see, if it was in Africa, it would probably be called a failing state. So we shouldn't underestimate the ridiculousness of this legislation, but also the way that it fundamentally breaches so many aspects of human rights legislation. And it's not just, individuals and groups in the UK that are saying Rwanda is not a safe place. Internationally, it's not recognised, I don't think, as a particularly safe place to send people. And even in Rwanda, there is criticism of what the government is their government is getting into with the Westminster government over this. And for Rishi Sunak last weekend, I think it was, to take on a bet over the plight of refugees being sent to Rwanda with Piers Morgan, it just shows you how debased this government is.
It is an absolutely staggering scenario that we find ourselves in, where the president of Rwanda is actually intimating he would like to walk away from the deal because of reputational damage. I mean, it's absolutely stunning. I mean, moving on to the story from the Resolution Foundation that more than 11 million people in the UK have less than £1,000 in saving, which is a pretty, basic amount to have some kind of cushion of some sort. It said the Resolution Foundation said 11.2 million people living in households that had savings of less than £1,000, accounting for about 1 in 3 working age households. As many as half lived in the poorest third of households in the UK. In a report with the Aberdeen Financial Fairness Trust, the foundation estimated that the UK had a £74 billion shortfall of funds saved for emergencies and for retirement, compared with a country in which every family had at least 3 months of income kept in precautionary savings. It said that fewer than half of working age households in the UK had savings worth at least 3 months of income, leaving them ill-equipped to face events such as unemployment or family breakdown. Highlighting the risks to households struggling with the cost of living crisis, it said those with lower levels of savings were more than twice as likely to use credit cards, overdrafts, or borrowed money than those with more than £1,000 held back. I mean, Maureen, you've worked for many years as a constituency MSP, and in your experience dealing with people who are facing financial insecurity, either because it's an ongoing financial insecurity or because suddenly somebody's lost a job unexpectedly or had ill health, what kind of issues have you seen coming to your door with people facing this kind of financial insecurity? What does that look like for those of us who are lucky enough not to be, living hand to mouth?
Yeah, I mean, the toll on your physical and mental health is indescribable. I mean, I've been retired since 2021, and yes, I did see it in my constituency office. But more recently, this has all got much worse, hasn't it, since the Liz Truss crashing the economy debacle. And, just in the last few months, I know of a family where the male household person in the household lost their job. He had to sell his car, which had just come to the end of paying off the finance on it. He sold it for probably less than it was worth, and it just creates so much misery for families that whether you try to mitigate it in terms of keeping some sort of false joy in the family, it just takes its toll on every single member, whether it's children not being able to partner activities at school or have decent clothing sometimes, because not everybody qualifies for a clothing grant, although it's been extended. And, I think the narrative is often forgotten that poverty is higher than in the rest of the UK, and that's because of the child payments that have been introduced in Scotland. So, with the best will in the world, mitigating it does help, but it doesn't solve the underlying problem of the inequality in Britain, which is dragging the economy down. It's, that's part of the reason the economy is in such a state, because everything is dragged down to the lowest common denominator, while at the top of the scale, money is siphoned off to offshore bank accounts by the wealthiest.
And of course, for people who have been in employment and perhaps have never experienced financial discomfort or insecurity, if they've got more than 3 children or more than 2 children, suddenly they're coming up against the dreaded rape clause and the realization that, suddenly they don't have money to feed all of their children. I mean, obviously in Scotland things are better, but I mean, how much of a realization do you think there is for people suddenly that there's no such thing as the deserving and the undeserving poor, that actually we all deserve to have a decent living standard?
Well, I think in Aberdeen in the northeast, we're perhaps more aware of cause of crashes that have been in the oil price, and the economy that was largely based on oil and gas has crashed a few times in my lifetime. There's the story, which is not a poll, it did happen, of somebody in a Porsche turning up at a food bank to get some food. So I think that here particularly, we probably are more aware of how quickly things can change in terms of security of employment. But whether people follow that through with having put away some savings, clearly this report shows that it's not what happens in a lot of families.
Yeah.
Just cannot afford
I mean,
to put any money away. And even if you do put money away, it disappears pretty quickly.
yes, I mean, for many of people who aren't even able to put a meal on the table in the evening, the thought of savings is just a luxury they can't afford. I mean, new analysis has found that things are probably about to get worse, with Brexit red tape costing almost £100 billion in annual UK exports. The analysis highlights that since leaving the EU single market and customs union, the UK's export growth has been sluggish, which has led to missed growth in exports of around £23 billion quarterly. It also shows that there was 30% less trade between 2020 and 2023 than if the UK had stayed in the trading bloc. Last month, Cambridge Econometrics estimated that Brexit would leave the UK £311 billion worse off by 2035. And analysis by the London School of Economics found that UK households have paid almost £7 billion to cover the cost of Brexit red tape. I mean, Maureen, what's your view on the growing awareness of the impact on Brexit? I mean, I never speak to a business that doesn't understand that Brexit has been a real kick in the teeth. But what's your understanding of the wider view of Brexit and its impact and its ongoing impact?
Well, I think in Scotland, we're just shaking our head, aren't we? Because, the vast majority of people didn't want to leave the EU in Scotland. And as they say, chickens are coming home to roost in the rest of the UK where they voted for it. But, we can keep going over old ground, and obviously the evidence is stacking up that it is a disaster and it's going to continue to be a disaster. And, no amount of trade deals with other countries is going to fill the gaping hole of, as you say, £100 billion. £100 billion. That's twice it's about twice the amount that we spend as a Scottish government, isn't it? I mean, it is a huge, and that is affecting every household. I mean, the last figure I recall was that each household is £28,000 worse off because of Brexit. Imagine that, £28,000. Now, that's not just because of food prices, but, lack of decent wage increases and inflation and everything. So I said earlier, didn't I, that the UK is a basket case. And this just confirms that, doesn't it?
Can you foresee conversations coming up to the general election, people perhaps pointing to Northern Ireland and Rishi Sunak's speech in which he said they were doing really well because businesses from overseas were saying, oh wow, you're an amazing place to invest in because you've got access both to the UK market and the European market. That's an amazing place to be, guys. He was, I mean, eventually we were watching going, what is this? But I mean, is
it's unbelievable, really, that he doesn't see what his the consequences of what he said. And I think people in Scotland were quick to pounce on that and say, well, if Northern Ireland, why not Scotland? Because we also voted to stay in the EU. And I think all these subjects are going to come up in the run up to a general election and during the campaign period, and whether they manage to convince people that the only way that in Scotland we can remedy this is with independence, it will be interesting to see. And I think the fact that independence still commands a majority in any polls shows you that people are considering this and will be considering this when they vote in the general election.
Well, another issue which may become very live for many people is the Conservatives. Education spokesperson Ros McCall has insisted she does support the Scottish Government's policy of free university tuition fees after the party was criticised by Shirley Ann Somerville MSP following comments by the Tory finance spokesperson Liz Smith, who was reported to have said that the existing policy of free tuition for Scottish domiciled students was not sustainable, and she supports the reintroduction of the graduate endowment. I mean, the Scottish Government under the SNP abolished tuition fees, and since then, the number of Scottish first-time, full-time degree entrants has grown by 31%, which is a record number of students from the poorest communities going to university. A recent report by the Commissioner on Fair Access has also made clear that the huge increase in people from the poorest communities going to university was not at the expense of other cohorts of Scottish students. I mean, do you think that I've seen it in a few different places over several weeks and months? You know, Liz Smith muttering about the re-establishment of basically fees, the payment of fees for Scottish students. Given the Tories' track record, does this surprise you? And what do you think young people and their parents will make of this?
I'm not surprised by it. It's interesting to see that there's a division of opinion in the Tory party, and it'd be interesting to see who's right, according to Douglas Ross. But I think it's important that people remember that England is the outlier here. It was the Tories and the Lib Dems in 2010 under David Cameron who introduced tuition fees in England, whereas the rest of Europe and Scotland, don't have tuition fees, and that allowed the free flow of students. And of course, we've seen the disaster with Brexit on how that has adversely affected Erasmus and other schemes in terms of, cross-working with research at universities, etc. So, if the Tories were to come into power in Scotland, clearly I do believe that they would they would introduce tuition fees. I've got no doubt about that, because they would do everything in their power to make sure that everything coalesced around what England was doing, and that any differences were blown away as soon as they possibly could, and say, well, why do we have devolution? Because, we're all doing the same things now. Let's just get back to not having any devolved administrations. The interesting
Is it not
thing
a bit odd though? I mean, given how many Conservative voters and politicians, one would imagine, have seen their families benefit from the lack of tuition fees. I mean, there does seem to be a really odd disconnect between the sort of some of the policies that come out. Why do you think that is? I mean, you've met a lot of these politicians, you've known a lot of them. Did you ever ask them what was going on in their heads?
Well, they would say, yes, we benefit, but we're Tories, and we think differently. But I think that the SNP have won so many elections across the whole of Scotland in richer areas and poorer areas because everybody benefits from tuition fees. And hopefully it's based on ability to learn, not on ability to pay. But yes, when push comes to shove, do Tory voters vote SNP because they're benefiting from not having to pay tuition fees? And I think that would play a large part in the influence of how you're going to vote in Scotland. I was going to go on to say that the interesting thing is what the Labour Party would do if they got into power in Scotland, or even at Westminster, what influence they would try to have on a Labour manifesto at the next Scottish Parliament elections.
And what do you think that would look like?
Well, it'd be interesting to see. I don't think we will get to know until and if Labour come to power in England, but it would be very interesting. And I think that's the kind of question I would be asking a Labour party candidate in the run up to the Scottish Parliament elections. What are they going? We've seen already that Keir Starmer is not going to abolish the two-child payment or the rape clause. So, what else would Labour like to see abolished in terms of all the good things that have happened in Scotland under the SNP?
It was a very enigmatic smile that you pass here. I mean, so do you think that it's not likely that Sir Keir Starmer will discover his spine, that it is more likely that they will try and bring Scotland down to the rest of England's level?
Well, shall we watch this space?
Well, watching this space is something Rupert Murdoch has been doing. He met Rishi Sunak 5 times over a 12-month period before he stepped down as a chair of News Corps in September last year, according to Westminster Records. Official records of government meetings analysed by the campaign group Hacked Off show that the former head of News Corps, which owns the Times and the Sun newspapers in the UK, personally met government representatives 12 times between October 2022 and September 2023, including 5 meetings with the Prime Minister. These include a dinner in December 2022 and a meeting the following day with Robert Thompson, the CEO of News Corps, and Rebecca Brooks, the CEO of News UK, the Times editor Tony Gallagher, former Sunday Times editor Emma Tucker, and Sun editor Victoria Newton to discuss the PM's priorities. The two men then met again in May 2023 for a political discussion, and again in June for the Times CEO Summit and subsequent party, and in September last year for a social meeting. There are no publicly available minutes of these meetings. I mean, this is an absolutely astonishing story. I mean, the independence of the Fourth Estate is something that was supposed to be a sort of an inviolable sort of institution, and now not only is it not necessarily being seen as being independent, it's the tail wagging the dog. I mean, subsequent sort of since Thatcher on, government prime ministers in Westminster have been terrified of of Rupert Murdoch and the Sun. I mean, it said Margaret Thatcher used to reach for the Sun before any other newspaper. How suspicious and how despondent should we be that this is a state of affairs going on down at Westminster?
Well, we should be despondent, but we shouldn't be surprised, because it has been going on with the two major parties, probably, as you say, since Thatcher's time. I mean, look how Tony Blair courted the media while he was running to be Prime Minister. And although they are recorded in terms of government ministers, but I wonder how many times Keir Starmer has met representatives of the media, and particularly, as you say, Rupert Murdoch's corporation, because so many of people in politics think if you've got the backing of the Sun, then that's what won it for you. As the Sun,
well, yeah, I mean, Hacked Off's analysis.
Yeah.
Hacked Off's analysis says that 72% of all meetings were with right of centre press, defined by the organisation as the Mail, the Sun, the Times, News UK, Express and Telegraph, while 5% were with left of centre press, defined as the Guardian and the Mirror. Murdoch-owned publications accounted for 40% of the total, while the Telegraph accounted for 19%. Meetings between the government and the Guardian accounted for 3% of the total. And records show that on the 29th of March last year, when the government published a draft media bill, the Culture Secretary, Lucy Fraser, had phone calls with editors of the Mail, the Sun, and the Times. The bill, which was aimed at reforming the regulation of public service broadcasting, radio, and online streaming, also rolls back a rule that would have required news outlets to pay the costs of people who sue them, unless the news outlet is signed up to a state-backed press regulator. Well, I'm just moving on to the next story, but if anybody wants to know what press independence looks like and wants to feel sentimental, they should try watching Borgen, the Danish that Danish series about news, which actually made me shed a tear in my memories of what the BBC used to be like. Nice and independent media outlet. Moving on to Spain, members of Spain's Conservative People's Party say they are stupefied after their party leader announced he was in favour of granting a conditional pardon to former Catalan President Carles Puigdemont for his role in the Catalan independence campaign in 2017. Until now, the PP has consistently condemned Spain's socialist Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez for offering an amnesty to Puigdemont and dozens of others involved in the independence movement in exchange for the votes of his party, Junts per Catalunya, which translates as Together for Catalonia. Since the amnesty was announced, the right-wing PP, along with a far-right Vox party, has organised dozens of demonstrations, several of them violent, against the plan. There was considerable surprise, therefore, when PP leader Alberto Núñez Feijóo is reported to have told a meeting with Spanish journalists on Saturday that he supported giving Puigdemont a conditional pardon. He later tried to qualify his remarks, saying that the conditions were not right at present, but he believed a conditional pardon could be possible in the future. The apparent turnaround has upset the PP as it faces a key election in Galicia on Sunday, a region which it has ruled for 34 of the past 43 years. With polls showing PP losing votes in the Galician nationalist bloc, the BNG, there is speculation about what Feijóo hopes to gain from his U-turn on a policy vehemently rejected until now by both the PP and Vox. This is a really interesting story in some ways, isn't it? I mean, sort of from our perspective. I mean, there is a Galician movement for independence as well, which is not quite as far ahead as the Catalonian movement. Do you have any insight into what you think is happening here?
I haven't. No, I hadn't heard of this story before I saw that we were discussing it tonight. And yeah, it does seem odd that a right-wing party is saying that Carlos Puigdemont should get a pardon. Yeah, I really haven't got much to add. I mean, it was ridiculous that people were jailed and barred from standing in elections anyway. And I haven't read anywhere of any kind of movements in political and political changes in Catalonia recently. I mean, I was there prior to one election a number of years back. But yeah, I don't know. It'd be interesting
do you
to see
think
what other
this
leaders of Catalonian independence say about this.
I mean, it is interesting when you think that Spain has been quite a right of centre nation for a number of years. Now they have a socialist prime minister. Recently, just had the king of Spain announcing that they were going to be sending support and funds to Palestine, the people of Palestine, following on sort of from so many nations believing Israel's what is shown to be quite false claims about the United Nations and UNRWA there. I mean, do you think that perhaps there's a shift to the left from in that PP are detecting a shift to the left, which mean that perhaps they're doing sort of wibbly wobbly, sort of almost like a well, we're not quite far right, honest. We could be good guys. I mean, is this kind of almost similar to Keir Starmer's dance to the centre right to try and appease people that and sort of make himself look more attractive? And do you think anybody's going to buy that?
I'm not in a position to say what's happening in Spain on that, but I moved to the. I know they've got a left of centre government at the moment, but that's kind of going against the flow, isn't it? In so many other countries in Europe at the moment. And Catalan nationalist parties, I never got the impression that they were particularly left or right wing. I mean, independence for Catalonia was the main driver there. So, whether there's a bigger shift in Spanish politics, which is also affecting Catalonia, it would be interesting to find out more about it and read some more in-depth articles about it.
Yeah, indeed, we should be watching this space. With watching Poland has managed to sort of pull itself back from the right-wing brink, so perhaps we're going to see something similar happening in Spain. And speaking
Hallelujah! Can it move quickly to the UK as well?
well, I mean, and you never know. There might be one would like to think there might be an infection of democracy happening in America. I mean, you've got Trump, who's being criticised. The White House immediately issued a rebuke to President Donald Trump, for saying, although he's not the current president, he is always the president, having retired from that post, for saying that he would encourage Russia to attack any of the US NATO allies whom he considers to have not met their financial obligations. The White House statement said encouraging invasions of our closest allies by murderous regimes is appalling and unhinged, and it endangers American national security, global stability, and our economy at home. The NATO chief, Jens Stoltenberg, has said any attack on the Western military alliance would be met with a united and forceful response after Donald Trump invited Russia to attack member countries that he perceived as not meeting their financial obligations. Stoltenberg said in a statement, any suggestion that allies will not defend each other undermines all of our security, including that of the US, and puts American and European soldiers at increased risk. I expect that, regardless of who wins the presidential election, the US will remain a strong and committed NATO ally. He said NATO remained ready and able to defend all allies. The Polish Defence Minister, Władysław Koźmiński-Kamysz, wrote on X, NATO's motto, one for all for one, is a concrete commitment. Undermining the credibility of allied countries means weakening the entirety of NATO. No election campaign is an excuse for playing with the security of the alliance. And that's an absolutely stunning story. When you think of the way in which American presidents across the decades, sort of a Reds under the beds and panic about commies, in America. When you think about all of this, and then there's Donald Trump, sort of basically kind of, Putin's sock puppet. I mean, what do you think is happening? It's not just so much Donald Trump, because, there are many in Scotland who view him as a bit of a bandpot. But for wider Republicans to have shifted so far in this narrative, do you think that this speaks of something more insidious happening across America? Or, I mean, at what point do you think it's going to be enough is enough for for Republican voters to sort of think that finally they perhaps have lost their dignity as well as their reason?
Well, I think this is Donald Trump. I don't think he would have consulted anyone else before he said this, and whether he thought about what he was saying much before he said it, one doubts as well. And, the Republicans are trying to say that Biden isn't fit. A man who says something like this to me is not fit to be anywhere near the presidency. And we must remember that it was kind of clear, was it not, that there may have been Russian money backing Trump's go at the White House when he won way back when 2015, was it? So, we shouldn't be surprised, I think, that he has come out with things like this. Whether it will dent his support among the Republican faithful, I think we would doubt, because most Republicans are not that interested in international affairs, are they? They're more concerned about their own dollar in their pocket and what their share portfolio is doing. So whether it will dent his support much, I doubt among the Republicans, but whether it will dent the voters in general when it comes to election time in presidential election in November, I hope it does make an impact. Pray that it does make an
But
impact.
I mean, in terms of the why, I mean, it's very much like the sort of scenario that's happening with the Conservative Party in over here, isn't it? I mean, it's sort of like, I mean, whether you agree with the politics or not, a once respectable body is being seriously demeaned by the behaviour of its incumbents, and it does make you wonder what that then looks like to those who have been serious candidates and representatives of the party in the past. I mean, it's does it do you see any parallels between the sort of the demeaning and the degrading, for example, of the Republicans and the demeaning and the degrading of the Conservative Party?
Yes, I do. I mean, and I think culture wars are part of this. Where this all ends, goodness knows. But it is a cynical debasement of politics and political dialogue. It has completely negated the idea that politicians are leaders of public opinion rather than followers of public opinion, something that really, really upsets me. I think politicians have got to stick their neck out sometimes when they think that things are going wrong and against the best interests of the vast majority of the population. I think there has been a gradual diminution of politicians prepared to do that. But whether we see a backlash and more politicians being willing to stand for, basically the rule of law and open democracy and justice and fairness, I think many countries are crying out for that now, aren't they? Not least the United States and United Kingdom.
But I mean, when you've got, I mean, we're very aware of the SNP's stance on many policies because it does seem to be a party which speaks quite clearly about where it stands on many issues. But when you've got the Labour Party shifting so far that suddenly you're not allowed to stand on if you're a Labour MP or a Labour politician, you're not allowed to stand on a picket line. You're not the things that Labour used to stand for, the things that the Conservatives used to stand for. I actually don't know what either party stands for anymore. And does that, if we're seeing this happening in democracy in America, does that turn people off democracy and does it turn them off voting? Or do you think that people sort of get more engaged because they want to see something that's meaningful? Like you could say that Macron perhaps in France, that his party was a new party, had never had any candidates before, and suddenly he's in power for 2 terms because people in France were finally fed up with just being served up the same dish over and over again.
Yes, and whether he's made a big enough difference, you could argue either way, I suppose, or whether and whether En Marche has just become a party like any other. But yes, he certainly did capture the population when he stood for president the first time. I do think people are turned off by this, that they don't see any party, whether it be Labour or Tories, with any principle anymore. I am delighted that, to me, the SNP has stuck by its original principles of being a left of centre party and carried out policies in that vein. Whether people will be sufficiently angry when they come to vote and see that their what they stand for, and think about that when they're voting, will be really interesting.
Well, I mean, looking at trust as being a crucial part of behaviours, a new study suggested that people's trust in the NHS across the UK was linked to increased uptake of the COVID-19 vaccine during the pandemic. Researchers at Edinburgh University have found that public confidence in the information issued by the healthcare system was the strongest predictor of vaccine uptake across the four nations. Looking at guidance shared in social media and messenger apps, which are more frequently mentioned as sources of information among young adults, was linked to a lower likelihood of having been vaccinated or intending to get the vaccine. The University of Edinburgh study assessed the views of more than 4,400 people aged 18 and over during the period of the 16th to 31st July 2021, a time when overall vaccination rates were high. The group were asked about their levels of trust and sources of advice on COVID-19, which sources they used, and their vaccination status. Researchers found that 85% of those surveyed were most likely to trust the NHS. This was followed by 79% expressing trust in family and friends and 77% trust in scientists. Trust in the UK government was relatively low at 48%. Compared to those in England, respondents in other UK nations, which were more likely to trust their respective governments, was the rates of, 63% in Scotland and 64% in Wales. The largest predictor for positive vaccination status was found to be trust in the NHS. Respondents aged 65 and over were 4 times as likely to have a positive vaccination status compared with the youngest group. Respondents least likely to be vaccinated were people aged 25 to 34 years old. It just goes to show, Maureen, doesn't it, that sort of behaviours and evidence among communities seems to make a difference. What do you think made such a big difference between trust in the UK government, which basically, was like the English wing, and Scotland and Wales? I mean, Ireland had 40% trust, so that was even lower than the Westminster government.
Well, first of all, I hope this study is put in front of the chair of the COVID inquiry. I think it'll be interesting to see if it's taken into account, and I hope this, when the COVID inquiry, the UK COVID inquiry, returns to Scotland, that this sort of study is brought to their attention. I've no doubt, and this is not the first study that has said that the daily briefings of the First Minister during the COVID pandemic were watched by thousands of people daily who wanted to know exactly what was happening, and Nicola Sturgeon came across as somebody you could trust, in stark contrast to Boris Johnson, who didn't do them daily, but when he did, just came across as somebody who wasn't really interested in what he was saying, and a bit of a buffoon, or a clown, as Nicola, in my view, rightly called him. So these things do matter, because we're supposed to be learning from the pandemic and doing things the same or differently, should, God forbid, another pandemic hit us, so that we're more prepared. So clearly, daily briefings by someone who was trusted did make a difference. And, a lot of the briefings were before a vaccine was available. And, thank goodness that the Scottish Government had in place the resources and the wherewithal to do vaccinations at a really quick pace once the vaccine was available. And that has continued.
That's a good place we have to. That's a place we have to leave it now. I'm afraid we're running out of time. That's it for this evening. Such an action-packed programme. We don't have time for it all. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who's donated and to everyone who's signed up to make regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We're just a wee bit shy of our £10,000 crowdfund our targets. If you've got a bobby, please chuck it at us. Thank you again to my guest, Maureen Watt. I'm Ruth Watson. Good night.